The trauma bay fell silent for only a heartbeat before the alarms began again, but a young float nurse in plain Navy scrubs moved quietly between the operating rooms, ignored by senior surgeons arguing over authority, while a heavily wounded military officer was rushed through the doors under armed escort. No one asked her opinion. No one noticed the way her eyes mapped every exit, every medical card, every frightened face. When the hospital's command structure began to collapse under the growing crisis, the surgeons dismissed her with a wave of the hand. Minutes later, a decorated Army Ranger colonel, pale from blood loss, forced himself upright against every medical order, looked directly at the forgotten nurse, and slowly raised his hand in a perfect military salute. In that instant, everyone realized they had been judging the wrong person. The first ambulance arrived before sunrise. Its siren echoed between the concrete walls of St. Catherine Regional Trauma Center before fading into the steady rhythm of automatic doors, rolling stretchers, and hurried footsteps. Night shift had not yet ended, and day shift had already begun to gather. In a Level 1 trauma hospital, there was never a true beginning or ending to the day. There was only the next patient. The emergency department carried its familiar sound, a mixture of cardiac monitors, overhead announcements, distant helicopter blades, and conversations spoken just loudly enough to rise above controlled chaos. At exactly 5:45 a.m., the charge nurse reviewed the staffing board with a tired sigh. "We're short again." No one looked surprised. One nurse had called in sick. Another had been pulled into the pediatric intensive care unit. Two surgical nurses were already working overtime after a difficult night. The charge nurse scanned the list one final time before reaching for the marker. "I'll use the float." Several heads turned. One surgeon glanced toward the board and frowned. "The float nurse. That's all we've got." He shrugged. "Fine. Keep her out of Trauma 1. Another physician added quietly. "They always need too much supervision." No one argued. They simply returned to preparing for another difficult morning. A woman in plain navy blue scrubs walked through the employee entrance carrying a small black lunch bag and a worn notebook. Her identification badge read, "Only Emily Carter, registered nurse, float pool." Nothing about the badge stood out. No special certifications displayed across the bottom. No colorful ribbons. No management title. Just another temporary nurse assigned wherever the hospital happened to need help. She greeted the security officer with a polite nod. "Morning. Morning." She continued inside without slowing her pace. Everything about her movements appeared ordinary. Not rushed. Not relaxed. Simply efficient. She checked the digital assignment board only once before memorizing every room number listed beside her name. Emergency department. Post-anesthesia care. Operating room support. Cardiac observation. For different assignments before lunch. She accepted them without complaint. Inside the staff lounge, several nurses gathered around the coffee machine. One looked toward Emily. "You floated here yesterday too?" Emily smiled. "Looks that way. Rough assignment. I've had worse." Another nurse laughed. "I heard they had you cleaning equipment between surgeries." Emily nodded. "They needed help." "You didn't mind?" "Patients needed clean instruments." The answer ended the conversation. There was nothing dramatic about it. No frustration. No attempt to impress anyone. She simply picked up her coffee and headed toward the emergency department. Dr. Nathan Mercer entered the trauma hallway moments later. Chief of Trauma Surgery. 20 years of experience. Respected. Demanding. Known throughout the hospital for impossible standards. He reviewed the morning staffing list while walking. "Who's covering Trauma 3? The charge nurse answered. "The float nurse." Mercer stopped. "The same one from last week?" "Yes." He looked over the list again. "She still doesn't belong in trauma. We're short. Pair her with someone experienced." "Already done." Mercer nodded once before continuing. As he passed Emily in the hallway, she stepped aside to let him through. He barely noticed her. The first patient arrived less than 10 minutes later. Motor vehicle collision. Male. 34 years old. Multiple fractures. Possible internal bleeding. The trauma room filled almost instantly. Doctors. Respiratory therapists. Nurses. Radiology staff. Everyone moved according to familiar routines. Emily remained near the medication station. Watching. Listening. Preparing supplies before anyone requested them. A surgeon reached for a chest tube kit. It was already beside him. "Who brought this?" No one answered. Another physician asked for additional blood tubing. Emily quietly handed it over before he finished speaking. He accepted it automatically. Moments later, he glanced up. Oh, he returned to the patient without another word. There was no applause for quiet efficiency, only work. Nearly an hour passed before the emergency department settled again. Emily disinfected equipment with careful attention to every surface. One of the younger nurses watched her. You know, most float nurses just finish the checklist. Emily continued wiping the monitor cables. The checklist is the minimum. You always do this. Someone has to. The younger nurse smiled. I wish everyone thought that way. Emily simply returned the equipment to its proper place. Every drawer remained organized. Every medication tray aligned. Every emergency airway cart stocked in exactly the same order. Tiny details. Easy to overlook. Critical when seconds mattered. Later that morning, she crossed into the surgical wing, carrying fresh supplies. Several orthopedic surgeons stood outside operating room 5 reviewing imaging scans. One glanced toward her. Can you take these specimens to pathology? Emily accepted the container. Of course. Before leaving, she noticed one surgical light hanging slightly lower than normal. She paused, looked upward for barely 2 seconds, then quietly informed the biomedical technician walking nearby. Can you inspect that arm before the next procedure? He looked confused. It seems fine. I may be mistaken. He shrugged. I'll check. 15 minutes later, he discovered a worn locking joint that could have slipped during surgery. He reported the defect. The operating room was temporarily closed while repairs were made. No announcement connected the discovery to Emily. The technician simply logged the maintenance report. Emily never mentioned it again. Near noon, the hospital cafeteria began filling with staff. Emily sat alone by a window. She opened her notebook. It contained no diary entries, no personal reflections. Instead, each page held carefully written observations. Supply shortages, equipment locations, emergency exits, department layouts, shift patterns. Nothing confidential, nothing inappropriate, only practical notes. A cafeteria employee walked past. You studying for another certification? Emily closed the notebook. Just keeping organized. The employee smiled. Wish I could stay that organized. Emily returned the smile. It makes difficult days easier. Across the room, 2 surgical residents noticed her. Who's she? The float. She always writes things down. Probably trying to impress administration. One laughed quietly. Float nurses never stay long anyway. Neither realized she could hear them. If she did, she gave no sign. She simply finished her lunch, washed her coffee cup, and returned it neatly to the drying rack. That afternoon, another emergency interrupted the relative calm. An elderly woman collapsed in the hospital lobby. Emily happened to be walking past. She reached the patient first. Without raising her voice, she checked the airway, breathing, and pulse. Call a rapid response. A nearby volunteer hesitated. Emily repeated the instruction once. Calm. Clear. The volunteer immediately moved. Within seconds, the rapid response team arrived. The emergency physician knelt beside the patient. What happened? Emily answered in precise order. 70 to 75 years old. Witness collapse. Airway clear. Pulse irregular. Brief loss of consciousness. Oxygen applied 3 minutes ago. No extra words. No guesses. Only verified facts. The physician nodded. Good. As the team wheeled the patient away, another nurse approached. You handled that well. Emily shrugged gently. It was what anyone should do. Late in the afternoon, the charge nurse updated assignments once more. Emily. Yes. I need you covering trauma 1 tomorrow morning. Emily nodded. I'll be here. Dr. Mercer overheard the conversation. He frowned. I thought I said keep the float out of trauma 1. We still don't have enough staff. Mercer looked toward Emily for the first time that day. You've worked trauma before? A few times. A few isn't enough. Emily answered respectfully. I'll follow whatever assignment I'm given, doctor. Her tone contained no challenge, no pride, only professionalism. Mercer shook his head. We'll see how tomorrow goes. He walked away before she could respond. Emily simply gathered her supplies. She showed no frustration, no disappointment, only the quiet acceptance of someone accustomed to being underestimated. As evening settled over St. Catherine Regional Trauma Center, another ordinary shift appeared to be ending. But somewhere beyond the city limits, a military convoy had already begun moving toward the hospital under sealed orders. Inside one armored vehicle sat a wounded Army Ranger colonel whose arrival would change everything. No one inside the hospital knew he was coming, except one nurse who, after glancing at an unusual security notification crossing a hallway monitor, paused for only a moment before continuing her work as if nothing had happened. She said nothing. She simply made a quiet note in her worn notebook and walked toward the trauma wing, ready for another shift that everyone believed would be ordinary. The chapter opens just before dawn on Emily's second consecutive shift. She arrives earlier than required, not because anyone asked her to, but because she dislikes beginning a shift unprepared. Before clocking in, she quietly walks the trauma corridor, confirming that emergency airway carts are sealed, blood warmers are plugged in, portable monitors are fully charged, and evacuation routes remain unobstructed. To everyone else, these are routine housekeeping details. To Emily, they are habits formed over years of working in environments where overlooked details cost lives. The charge nurse notices Emily replacing a depleted oxygen cylinder that maintenance has not yet reached. When thanked, Emily simply replies that it was easier to replace it herself than wait for someone else. The interaction lasts only seconds, but it leaves the charge nurse with the feeling that Emily always seems to notice problems before anyone reports them. Throughout the morning, Emily continues rotating between departments. Rather than standing idle while waiting for assignments, she quietly assists wherever pressure builds. She helps a respiratory therapist prepare emergency equipment, reorganizes medication trays after a difficult overnight resuscitation, and notices a mislabeled blood sample before it reaches the laboratory. She corrects the error discreetly, ensuring the responsible nurse never faces unnecessary embarrassment. These moments slowly build her reputation among nurses as dependable, though most physicians barely notice. The surgeons remain convinced she is simply an efficient float nurse with good instincts. Dr. Nathan Mercer continues to view her with skepticism. During morning rounds, he watches Emily anticipating instrument requests and believes she is merely copying experienced staff. When another surgeon comments that she seems unusually composed under pressure, Mercer dismisses the observation, insisting that confidence is not the same as experience. Emily never responds to criticism. Instead, she quietly continues working, believing that arguments waste time better spent caring for patients. Midway through the chapter, subtle hints emerge that Emily sees the hospital differently from everyone else. While transporting supplies, she briefly pauses at a security door after noticing it fails to latch completely. She informs hospital security without making the issue sound urgent, preventing unnecessary panic. The security officer later discovers the malfunction was genuine and quietly repairs it. Later, she notices unfamiliar contractors studying the trauma entrance longer than necessary. They prove to be legitimate maintenance workers, but Emily's careful observation reveals a mindset that constantly evaluates people, exits, and unusual behavior. The reader begins to understand that she possesses training far beyond ordinary nursing, although its origin remains unexplained. Inside the emergency department, a difficult trauma case arrives following a highway collision. During the resuscitation, the room becomes crowded and tense. Instead of competing for space or recognition, Emily positions herself where she can support everyone else. She quietly passes equipment before requests are spoken, anticipates medication needs, and gently redirects a panicked junior nurse without raising her voice. After the patient is stabilized, the attending physician remarks that the room somehow felt unusually organized despite the chaos. No one realizes Emily's calm presence subtly shaped the entire response. The chapter's emotional center comes during a brief conversation in the staff lounge. A new graduate nurse admits she feels overwhelmed by trauma care and worries she does not belong in such a demanding hospital. Emily offers no dramatic speech. She simply shares practical advice. Focus on the patient directly in front of you. Complete one task well before worrying about the next. And remember that calm decisions often save more lives than hurried ones. The conversation leaves the younger nurse feeling steadier without ever realizing how much experience stands behind Emily's quiet words. Meanwhile, the hospital administration receives a confidential call from federal authorities. A classified military medical transport may require the trauma center's resources within the next 24 hours. Details are intentionally limited. Only a handful of senior administrators, security supervisors, and Dr. Mercer are informed. Staff are told only that they should expect a high-security patient. The announcement generates speculation throughout the hospital. Some assume a politician is arriving. Others guess it may involve organized crime or witness protection. Emily overhears the rumors, but never joins the conversation. Instead, she quietly checks that the trauma bay's emergency backup equipment remains fully operational. As the afternoon progresses, strange but subtle changes appear throughout the hospital. Additional security officers arrive without explanation. Certain entrances become restricted. Communications testing briefly interrupts normal paging systems. Most employees treat these as administrative inconveniences. Emily quietly notices every change, but asks no questions. Near the end of the chapter, Dr. Mercer observes Emily reviewing trauma room layouts from memory while preparing supplies. He remarks that she seems unusually familiar with emergency planning for someone who has floated between hospitals. Emily simply replies that preparation becomes habit after enough difficult shifts. Mercer accepts the explanation, though something about her answer leaves him unconvinced. The chapter closes at sunset. Outside the hospital, several dark military vehicles enter the city under police escort, still miles away from St. Catherine Regional Trauma Center. Inside, Emily finishes stocking Trauma Room 1, pauses for a brief moment as distant helicopter blades become faintly audible, and quietly looks toward the ambulance entrance. She says nothing. She simply returns to her work. The reader is left with the growing sense that Emily recognizes the signs of something approaching long before anyone else does, while the true reason for her extraordinary composure remains carefully hidden. The rain began just after sunset. It was light at first, barely enough to leave dark patches across the ambulance entrance. By early evening, however, the steady drizzle had settled over the city, washing the streets in reflections of blue emergency lights and white headlights. Inside St. Catherine Regional Trauma Center, the emergency department maintained its relentless pace. A child with a broken arm waited beside his mother. An elderly man complained of chest pain. Two paramedics pushed a construction worker toward radiology after a workplace accident. Nothing about the evening appeared unusual. Emily Carter moved quietly through the trauma corridor, checking supplies one final time before handing over a patient to the intensive care team. Her movements remained efficient and unhurried, the same measured rhythm she had carried since the beginning of her shift. She placed a fresh airway kit inside Trauma Room 1. She verified the blood warmer. She checked the portable suction unit. Then she stepped back and looked across the room. Everything was exactly where it belonged. The charge nurse walked past carrying a clipboard. "You've checked that room twice already." Emily offered a small smile. "I'd rather find a problem now than later." The charge nurse nodded. "I can't argue with that." Neither of them knew how soon later would arrive. At 7:42 p.m., a secure telephone rang inside the hospital administration office. The hospital director answered immediately. His expression changed before he spoke a single word. "I understand." He listened for nearly a minute. "No, we'll keep the information restricted." Another pause. "Everything will be ready." He hung up slowly. Within minutes, 3 department heads received encrypted notifications. Only a handful of people were informed. The message was brief. High-priority military casualty inbound. Estimated arrival, 20 minutes. Maximum security protocol. Prepare Trauma Room 1. No diagnosis. No name. No explanation. Dr. Nathan Mercer read the notification while walking toward the operating suites. He immediately began issuing instructions. Clear Trauma 1. Cancel non-essential procedures. I want blood products available before the patient arrives. Residents hurried away. Nurses rushed toward supply rooms. Security officers appeared throughout the emergency department. Patients and visitors noticed doors being locked that normally remained open. Questions spread faster than answers. Emily watched the changes without asking anyone what had happened. She simply observed. 2 additional security officers took positions near the ambulance entrance. A communications technician tested emergency radio channels. Hospital maintenance quietly secured exterior loading areas. She noticed each detail, not because she was searching for secrets, because careful observation had long ago become habit. A young resident approached her. "Emily." "Yes." "We're preparing Trauma 1. I've already stocked it." He blinked. All ready. She nodded. Everything's ready. He looked inside the room. Chest tube trays. Rapid infuser. Ultrasound. Emergency thoracotomy set. Medication cart. Everything had already been positioned exactly where it should be. He looked back toward her. You somehow knew? Emily simply answered. It never hurts to prepare. Outside the hospital, traffic slowed unexpectedly. Not because of an accident. Because police motorcycles began closing intersections. Drivers pulled aside. A convoy of dark military vehicles moved steadily through the city without sirens. Their windows remained black. No markings identified the unit. Only disciplined precision. The lead vehicle never exceeded the speed limit. The convoy moved without urgency. Yet every officer on the road understood its importance. Inside the emergency department, rumors spread. A senator? No. Federal witness. I heard military. General? Nobody knows. Emily heard every conversation. She joined none of them. Instead, she quietly replaced a cracked 4-extension set she noticed on a nearby cart. No one saw her do it. No one thanked her. The equipment was simply safe when someone needed it. At exactly 8:03 p.m., the first helicopter could be heard overhead. Not landing. Passing. Seconds later, another sound followed. Heavy diesel engines. The convoy had arrived. Security officers opened the ambulance bay. The emergency department fell strangely quiet. Even patients waiting in nearby rooms sensed something unusual. 3 military police officers entered first. Their eyes scanned every hallway before signaling toward the entrance. Then the stretcher appeared. The wounded officer lay motionless beneath warmed blankets. His uniform had already been cut away during field treatment, leaving only fragments of camouflage beneath sterile dressings. Multiple 4 lines were already running. Blood transfusion continued during transport. An oxygen mask covered most of his face. His injuries were serious. Even without medical training, anyone could see that. Walking beside the stretcher was a gray-haired military physician. His voice remained calm. Male. 48. Multiple penetrating injuries. Significant blood loss. Emergency surgery required. The trauma team surrounded the patient immediately. Dr. Mercer stepped forward. I'm Nathan Mercer, Chief of Trauma Surgery. The military physician nodded once. Colonel Daniel Hayes. Mercer's expression tightened. The patient? No. He looked toward the stretcher. Our patient is Ranger Colonel Michael Donovan. No one reacted outwardly, but several staff members exchanged quick glances. A Ranger Colonel. That explained the security. Emily remained near the medication station, watching, listening, preparing. She noticed something others overlooked. One 4-pump battery displayed a low-power warning. Without interrupting anyone, she unplugged the unit, replaced the battery, confirmed the settings, and returned it to the transport medic before the alarm sounded. The medic barely realized what had happened. He simply nodded his thanks. The military physician continued his report. Patient remained conscious for most of transport. He refused sedation until reaching definitive care. He repeatedly requested updates on his team. Mercer asked, any known allergies? None. Previous surgeries? Documented in the file. Emily quietly accepted the medical folder and handed it directly to the circulating nurse before anyone requested it. Again, no words. Only timing. As the trauma team transferred the colonel onto the hospital bed, the cardiac monitor briefly lost contact. A sharp alarm echoed through the room. Several younger staff members instinctively reached toward different cables at once. Emily calmly raised one hand. Lead detached. Her voice remained soft. Not commanding. Simply factual. Within seconds, the loose connector was secured. The monitor stabilized. The interruption lasted less than 5 seconds. Yet panic had already begun spreading before disappearing just as quickly. Dr. Mercer noticed her. For the first time since meeting Emily, he watched rather than dismissed. She never rushed, never froze, never competed for attention. She simply solved problems before they became larger ones. Still, he said nothing. There was surgery to begin. As preparations continued, Colonel Hayes quietly stepped aside and spoke with hospital security. No unauthorized visitors. No photographs. No media. If additional military personnel arrive, escort them directly to me. The security supervisor agreed immediately. Emily overheard the instructions while preparing sterile equipment. Her expression never changed. Moments later, the wounded colonel stirred. Only slightly. His eyes opened for a brief second. Clouded by pain, he struggled to focus. The trauma team leaned closer. Mercer placed a hand near his shoulder. Colonel Donovan, you've arrived safely. We're taking you into surgery. The colonel's eyes moved slowly across the room, past the bright lights, past unfamiliar faces. For just an instant, they rested on Emily. She was adjusting an infusion line near the foot of the bed. Their eyes met. No words were exchanged. No recognition appeared. Only a brief, unreadable pause. Then his eyes closed again as exhaustion overtook him. Emily returned to her work. If the moment meant anything to her, she gave no sign. The operating room doors opened. The surgical team began moving the colonel toward emergency surgery. Rain continued falling outside. The convoy remained parked under heavy security. Inside the hospital, every person believed the most difficult part of the night was about to begin. None of them realized the true crisis had not yet reached its peak. The wounded Ranger colonel had survived the battlefield. Now the greatest test would unfold inside the walls of St. Catherine Regional Trauma Center, where assumptions about authority, experience, and quiet competence would soon be challenged in ways no one expected. The operating room doors closed with a heavy mechanical click. Outside, the trauma corridor seemed quieter than before, but it was the uneasy silence that often settled over a hospital when everyone knew something important was happening behind closed doors. Inside Operating Room 1, the atmosphere was controlled. Bright surgical lights illuminated the table. Monitors displayed a constant stream of numbers. Every member of the surgical team knew their assignment. Dr. Nathan Mercer stood at the head of the operating table. Time of incision, 8:31 p.m. The circulating nurse confirmed the time. The anesthesiologist nodded. The operation began. Emily was not assigned inside the operating room. As a float nurse, she remained outside, moving wherever the hospital needed additional support. Some staff saw that as proof she lacked experience. Others barely noticed her at all. She accepted another assignment without comment. Blood products needed to be transported. Laboratory samples required immediate delivery. Families needed directions. Patients still arrived through the emergency entrance. Life inside the hospital never paused for one critical surgery. An hour passed. The waiting area slowly filled. Military personnel sat quietly without conversation. Their uniforms carried no unnecessary decorations. Their posture alone distinguished them. Hospital visitors occasionally looked toward them before looking away again. No one interrupted them. Colonel Daniel Hayes stood near the operating room entrance with folded arms. His face remained calm, though fatigue was visible beneath his eyes. Every few minutes, he checked his watch. Not impatiently, simply measuring time. Inside the operating room, the first complication appeared. The colonel's blood pressure began falling. Pressure dropping. Mercer looked toward anesthesia. Increased support. Medication was adjusted. The numbers improved slightly. Then they fell again. Another injury became visible beneath damaged tissue. More bleeding than expected. The operation slowed. No one spoke louder than necessary. Every instruction remained calm. Professional. Disciplined. Outside, Emily received a call from the blood bank. 2 additional units are ready. I'll collect them. She reached the laboratory in less than 2 minutes. The technician handed over the insulated container. Please verify. Emily read every label carefully. Patient identification, blood type, expiration times. Everything matched. As she turned to leave, something caught her attention. One transport cooler remained partially unlatched. She stopped, opened it. Inside was another emergency blood shipment intended for intensive care. The temperature indicator had begun rising. She immediately secured the lid before notifying the technician. He stared at the display. I thought I locked that. It happens. If that had stayed open. He didn't finish the sentence. Emily simply nodded and continued towards surgery. By the time she reached the operating suite, another problem had developed. One of the pneumatic tube stations had failed. Critical laboratory results could not be delivered electronically. Residents began running paperwork manually through the corridors. Frustration spread quickly. It's slowing everything down. We're losing time. Hospital staff started talking over one another. Emily quietly walked to the central desk. Who has the latest lab results? A resident lifted several printed pages. I do. Operating room 1. Yes. I'll take them. She left before anyone argued over responsibility. When she reached the operating room doors, a circulating nurse accepted the documents. Perfect timing. Emily simply nodded. As she turned away, she noticed another small detail. An emergency crash cart had been left several feet outside its designated position after another patient transfer. She rolled it back into place. No one noticed. But the hallway was clear again. The emergency department suddenly grew louder. Another ambulance arrived. Then another. A multi-vehicle highway collision had occurred on the interstate. Within minutes, 3 trauma rooms were occupied. The charge nurse looked around desperately. "We need another experienced nurse." Several staff members were already committed elsewhere. Emily stepped forward. "I'm available." The charge nurse nodded immediately. Trauma 3. She didn't hesitate. A young man arrived with severe chest injuries. His breathing became increasingly difficult. The emergency physician began issuing rapid instructions. Oxygen, portable ultrasound, chest tray. Emily anticipated each request before it was repeated. Equipment appeared exactly when needed. The physician barely had to look away from the patient. The room felt unusually organized despite the growing pressure. A new graduate nurse struggled while preparing medication. Her hands trembled. Emily moved beside her. "Take one breath." The younger nurse looked at her. "Read the label again." She did. "I almost picked the wrong concentration." Emily answered quietly. "Now you won't." No criticism. No embarrassment. The medication was prepared correctly. The patient remained stable. Across the hallway, Dr. Mercer temporarily stepped out of surgery to review fresh imaging. He paused outside Trauma 3. Through the observation window, he watched Emily. She never raised her voice, never rushed. Yet everyone nearby seemed to move with greater confidence. The physician leading the trauma barely noticed she was coordinating half the room simply through timing and preparation. Mercer frowned thoughtfully. There was something unusual about her. Not dramatic, not obvious, just disciplined. He returned to surgery. The operation had become increasingly difficult. Additional bleeding complicated visibility. The anesthesiologist spoke calmly. "We're approaching another transfusion threshold." Mercer nodded. "Continue." The operating room remained composed, but the margin for error was narrowing. Meanwhile, the hospital experienced another unexpected setback. A temporary electrical fluctuation interrupted power in one section of the surgical wing. Emergency backup systems activated immediately. Lights remained on. Ventilators continued functioning. No patient was placed in immediate danger, but communications briefly failed. Several electronic records became inaccessible. Staff members began relying on handwritten documentation. Confusion spread through multiple departments. Hospital administration struggled to coordinate updates. Emily quietly began carrying written information between departments. No one assigned her to do it. She simply recognized the need. One physician later remarked, "I don't know how messages kept arriving." Another nurse answered, "I think the float nurse has been delivering most of them." Neither realized how many unnecessary delays she had quietly prevented. Late in the evening, Colonel Hayes stepped into the corridor. He approached the nurse's station. "Any updates?" The charge nurse answered carefully. "They're still operating." He nodded. "No changes." "Not yet." As he turned away, he noticed Emily organizing replacement trauma supplies. She acknowledged him politely. Nothing more. To Colonel Hayes, she appeared no different from every other hardworking nurse in the hospital. He continued walking. Near midnight, the operating room doors finally opened. Dr. Mercer removed his surgical gloves with tired hands. "The surgery is complete." Relief spread through the hallway. The colonel is alive. But Mercer's expression remained serious. "The next 24 hours will determine everything." The patient was transferred toward the intensive care unit under close observation. Emily walked alongside the transport team, silently checking 4 lines, monitoring cables, and oxygen tubing one last time before they reached the elevator. She corrected a twisted infusion line with a single movement so small that no one else noticed. The monitor remained steady. The transport continued without interruption. No one thanked her. She had not expected them to. As the ICU doors closed behind the stretcher, Emily looked through the glass for only a moment before returning to the trauma corridor. Another ambulance siren echoed outside. Another patient needed care. The night was far from over. And although the colonel had survived the operating room, the hospital itself was beginning to strain under the growing weight of the crisis. For the first time, Dr. Mercer found himself wondering a question he had dismissed only hours earlier. Who exactly was the quiet float nurse who always seemed to be standing in the right place before anyone realized they needed her? The clock above the nurse's station read 12:18 a.m. For most of the city, the night had settled into silence. Inside St. Catherine Regional Trauma Center, it had only become heavier. The emergency department remained full. The intensive care unit had accepted the Ranger Colonel less than 20 minutes earlier. Operating Room 1 was being cleaned and prepared for its next emergency. The waiting room held anxious families, exhausted nurses, and military personnel who spoke only when necessary. No one considered the crisis over. They simply believed the hardest part had passed. Emily washed her hands slowly at the trauma sink. She stared at the running water for only a moment before drying her hands and returning to work. There was no sense of relief on her face. Years of experience had taught her that the most dangerous moments often came after people believed they could finally relax. She picked up the assignment board. 2 nurses had reached the end of their legal shift. Another had developed a migraine severe enough to leave the floor. 1 respiratory therapist had been called to neonatal intensive care. The board looked increasingly empty. No one complained. Everyone simply kept moving. At the central desk, the charge nurse rubbed her temples. "We're running out of people." A clerk looked up. "I've already called everyone on the standby list." No answers. Not yet. Emily quietly studied the assignment sheet. Trauma 3 had stabilized. Cardiac observation needed help. The ICU required additional supply support. Radiology had requested transport assistance. She spoke calmly. "I can cover cardiac until another nurse arrives." The charge nurse looked at her. "You've already worked 12 hours. I'm still clear to continue." "You don't have to." "I know." The charge nurse hesitated before nodding. "Thank you." Emily simply picked up another patient file. Dr. Nathan Mercer stepped out of the intensive care unit after speaking with Colonel Daniel Hayes. The surgery had succeeded, but success was relative. The colonel remained heavily sedated. His blood pressure was stable only because of medication. The next several hours would determine whether his body could recover. Mercer walked toward the nurse's station. "How's staffing?" The charge nurse answered honestly. "Not good." He sighed. "We'll manage." Emily was organizing medication trays nearby. Mercer's eyes paused on her briefly. For the first time, he noticed something unusual. She never seemed hurried. Not because she worked slowly, because every movement appeared planned before it happened. She reached for supplies only once. She never searched, never doubled back, never hesitated. It reminded him less of hospital routine and more of someone following a carefully rehearsed system. The thought disappeared almost as quickly as it arrived. He returned to reviewing laboratory results. A call came from cardiac observation. "Room 12 needs assistance." Emily arrived within moments. An elderly woman recovering from heart surgery had become frightened after waking unexpectedly. The monitor showed an elevated heart rate. Her breathing had quickened. She clutched the bed rail. "I can't breathe." Emily looked carefully. The oxygen tubing remained connected. The airway was clear. The monitors showed anxiety more than medical collapse. She pulled a chair beside the bed instead of standing over the patient. "My name is Emily." The woman's eyes met hers. "You're safe." "My chest hurts." "That's expected after surgery." "Am I dying?" Emily answered without hesitation. "No." She checked the surgical dressing. "Normal." She adjusted the pillow slightly. The patient relaxed almost immediately. Within 2 minutes, her heart rate began falling. The physician arrived shortly afterward. "What happened?" Emily summarized only verified facts. Postoperative anxiety. No respiratory compromise. Pain controlled after repositioning. The physician examined the patient. "I agree." After he left, the elderly woman quietly reached for Emily's hand. "Thank you for staying." Emily smiled gently. "You don't have to face the night alone." She left before the patient could say anything more. Back in the emergency department, another challenge emerged. The computerized medication system temporarily slowed after the earlier communications disruption. Orders took longer to appear. Frustration spread quickly. One resident muttered, "This system is going to bury us tonight." Emily looked around the nurse's station. Instead of waiting for the computers to recover, she quietly organized handwritten medication verification sheets, ensuring every physician and nurse had the information they needed without unnecessary delays. She never announced what she was doing. Others simply found the paperwork waiting when they reached for it. One experienced nurse noticed. "You already sorted all of these?" Emily nodded. It seemed faster. The nurse shook her head. "You always seem to arrive before the problem." Emily offered only a small smile. "I've just learned not to wait." Near 1 o'clock in the morning, hospital security reported a minor disturbance near the ambulance entrance. Several reporters had gathered outside after hearing rumors that a military patient had been admitted. Security redirected them without incident. Inside, staff members grew increasingly distracted. Questions spread through every department. Who is he? Was he injured overseas? Is someone important coming? Emily ignored every conversation. Instead, she checked each emergency exit while transporting supplies between departments. Every door opened smoothly. Every corridor remained clear. It took less than 5 minutes. No one knew she had done it. Colonel Daniel Hayes watched the activity from outside the ICU. Military discipline had taught him to observe people before speaking to them. Over the past several hours, one face kept appearing. The float nurse. She seemed to move through every department. Emergency, surgery, cardiac, ICU. Always calm, always prepared, never lingering, never drawing attention. He asked a nearby nurse, "How long has she worked here?" "I'm not sure. She's from the float pool. She fills staffing gaps." Hayes nodded thoughtfully. Nothing more. At approximately 1:40 a.m., an alarm sounded inside the intensive care unit. Not from the colonel. From another patient whose breathing suddenly deteriorated. The ICU team rushed into one room. Several nurses left the hallway simultaneously. For a brief moment, the unit became dangerously understaffed. Emily happened to be delivering replacement for pumps. She immediately recognized the gap. Without waiting for instructions, she positioned herself at the central monitoring station. Not to take command, simply to watch. One monitor displayed an irregular rhythm. Another patient attempted to climb out of bed. A ventilator alarm sounded because of a loose sensor. Emily addressed each issue in order of urgency. She called the respiratory therapist for the sensor. She redirected another nurse toward the confused patient. She notified the physician about the changing heart rhythm. Her voice never rose. Within minutes, the ICU regained its balance. When the charge nurse returned, she stopped. "What happened?" Emily answered simply. "Everyone was busy, so I watched the monitors." The charge nurse looked across the unit. Every patient was stable. No crisis had developed. She nodded slowly. "Good thinking." Emily returned the 4 pumps to storage. The conversation ended there. Later, Dr. Mercer reviewed the ICU event log. Every action had been documented. Every decision had been appropriate. He looked toward the charge nurse. Who coordinated this? She glanced across the hallway. The float nurse. Mercer looked surprised. Emily, she didn't take over. She just kept everyone connected. Mercer closed the chart. For the first time since meeting her, he found himself reconsidering his earlier judgment. Competence under pressure could not be explained by luck alone. Still, questions remained. Where had she learned to stay so composed? Why did she always seem to anticipate the next problem? And why did she never seek recognition for any of it? Near the end of the shift, Emily entered the ICU to replace supplies. She paused briefly outside the Ranger Colonel's room. The patient remained unconscious. Machines breathed and monitored for him. Colonel Hayes stood silently beside the bed. He noticed Emily through the glass. She checked the medication card outside the room, adjusted a misplaced emergency airway kit by a few inches, and quietly walked away. No words. No dramatic moment. Just another small act of preparation. Hayes watched her disappear around the corner. Something about her quiet precision felt strangely familiar. He could not explain why, but years of military service had taught him one lesson above all others. The people who spoke the least were often the ones who carried the greatest responsibility. Outside, the rain finally stopped. Inside the hospital, the night settled into an uneasy calm. No one realized that before dawn, a complication would force impossible decisions. Decisions that would begin exposing the true depth of Emily Carter's discipline without revealing the life she had left behind. The hospital clock turned to 3:07 a.m. For the first time in hours, the emergency department was quiet. Not peaceful, only waiting. The waiting room had nearly emptied. Several exhausted nurses leaned against the central desk, finishing patient notes before the next ambulance arrived. The overhead lights remained bright, making it impossible to tell whether it was midnight or morning. Emily Carter stood alone in the supply room. She counted the remaining emergency blood tubing. For complete sets, she made a note on the inventory sheet and returned the clipboard without saying a word. The hospital looked calm. She had learned long ago that appearances meant very little. A shrill alarm shattered the silence. It came from the intensive care unit, not the loud, continuous alarm of cardiac arrest. A rapid series of warning tones. One of the ICU nurses spoke into her radio. Room 8. Physician to room 8 immediately. Within seconds, doctors and nurses hurried toward the unit. Emily was already walking in that direction with replacement for supplies. She stepped aside as the team rushed past. Inside the room, Ranger Colonel Michael Donovan's blood pressure had fallen sharply. The surgical repair itself remained intact. The danger came from the body's response to massive blood loss and prolonged trauma. Dr. Mercer arrived moments later. Report. The ICU physician answered quickly. Pressure continues to fall despite support. Urine output is dropping. We're losing perfusion. Mercer studied the monitors. Increase vasopressors. Repeat blood gases. Call the laboratory. The room became a blur of controlled movement. Emily remained outside. She knew the room already contained everyone it could safely hold. Adding another person would only create congestion. Instead, she turned toward the nurse's station. The laboratory requested additional blood samples. Pharmacy needed updated medication orders. Radiology called regarding portable imaging. Each department required information. Each assumed someone else would communicate it. Emily quietly gathered the requests into a single written list. One trip accomplished what would otherwise require 4. No one assigned her the task. She simply prevented unnecessary movement. The charge nurse noticed. I was just about to organize all of that. Emily handed over the completed list. It's already grouped by department. The nurse looked surprised. You've thought 3 steps ahead again. Emily gave the same answer she always did. It saves time. Inside the ICU, the colonel's condition stabilized briefly. Only briefly. Another complication emerged. The blood bank contacted Dr. Mercer. We're critically low on O-negative units. The night's emergencies had nearly exhausted the hospital's immediate reserve. Additional blood was available from a neighboring medical center. Transport would take time. Time the colonel might not have if another major transfusion became necessary. Mercer rubbed his forehead. We'll conserve every unit. No one argued. There was no alternative. Elsewhere in the hospital, another emergency ambulance arrived. A family injured in a highway collision entered the emergency department almost simultaneously. One operating room had already closed for cleaning. The second was occupied. Resources became stretched within minutes. The charge nurse stared at the assignment board. We can't split everyone. Someone had to decide where staff would go. Every choice carried consequences. Emily quietly reviewed the board. One trauma patient was now stable enough to move to a monitored floor. The transfer had been delayed because no nurse had time to arrange it. She approached the attending physician. Doctor, if room 4 transfers now, you'll have another trauma bed available. The physician reviewed the chart. You're right. Within minutes, the patient was safely transferred. The newly available room accepted the incoming accident victim without delay. No one celebrated. The transition simply happened. The emergency department continued functioning. Later, the hospital administrator approached the ICU. We may need to postpone tomorrow morning's elective surgeries. Dr. Mercer nodded. Do it. The administrator hesitated. The families won't be happy. Mercer answered quietly. They'll be disappointed. He glanced toward the ICU. They'll still have tomorrow. The administrator understood. Some decisions were unpopular. Others were necessary. As dawn approached, fatigue became the hospital's greatest enemy. Residents reread the same chart twice. Nurses paused to remember medication times. Coffee cups multiplied across every workstation. Emily noticed a young resident preparing medication while struggling to stay awake. She walked beside him. When did you last eat? He looked confused. I don't remember. She handed him a sealed nutrition bar from her lunch bag. You'll think more clearly after 5 minutes. I can't leave. You don't have to. He accepted it reluctantly. 20 minutes later, he quietly thanked her. She simply nodded and continued working. At 4:36 a.m., another setback struck. A refrigerated medication cabinet reported a temperature fault. Several critical medications had to be inspected before use. Pharmacy staff became overwhelmed. Emily joined them without being asked. She read lot numbers aloud while another pharmacist verified each container. The process became twice as fast. No shortcuts, no guesses, only careful verification. One pharmacist finally looked up. "You've done this before." Emily answered carefully. "I've worked in places where supplies mattered." It was true, just not in the way anyone imagined. Colonel Daniel Hayes watched her from across the hallway. The answer lingered in his mind. Worked in places where supplies mattered. There had been something different about the way she said it. Not dramatic, not nostalgic, matter of fact, like someone remembering experience rather than imagining it. Still, he said nothing. Shortly before sunrise, Dr. Mercer gathered the senior staff. "The colonel has survived the night." Relief spread through the room. "But he's not out of danger." He reviewed the next phase of treatment. As everyone dispersed, Mercer remained standing. His eyes followed Emily as she quietly restocked an emergency airway cart that had been used hours earlier. She checked every latch, every seal, every medication drawer. Nothing escaped her attention. Mercer walked toward her. "You've been here almost 18 hours. Yes. You should go home." Emily closed the drawer gently. "If my replacement arrives on time, I will. If they don't, I'll stay. You don't owe the hospital that." Emily met his eyes for the first time. "I don't stay because I owe the hospital." She paused. "I stay because patients don't choose when they need help." For a moment, neither of them spoke. There was no speech about sacrifice, no attempt to impress, just a simple statement that explained everything about how she approached her work. Mercer gave a slow nod. "I misjudged you." Emily answered quietly. "We've all misjudged someone at some point." Before he could respond, another overhead page echoed through the corridor. She turned immediately toward the sound. Duty came first. Conversation could wait. Mercer watched her disappear down the hallway. The thought returned once again. Who was she before she became a float nurse? He still had no answer. But for the first time, he realized the question itself mattered. As the first light of morning filtered through the hospital windows, Ranger Colonel Michael Donovan stirred faintly for the first time since surgery. His eyelids opened only briefly. His vision was blurred. The room was quiet. Outside the glass, Emily walked past carrying fresh fluids to another patient. He watched her for only a second before exhaustion overtook him again. Something about her posture, the calm, the precision, the discipline. It awakened a memory he could not yet fully grasp. The recognition had not arrived, but it was close, very close.